The icy wind swept through the streets of Boston, carrying with it tiny snowflakes that piled up on the sidewalks. It was a typical winter night, silent except for the hurried footsteps of those trying to escape the biting cold. Amidst this scene, Emily Carter, a 27-year-old woman, walked slowly, feeling her feet sink into the soft snow. Her red scarf was wrapped tightly around her neck, but it did little to hide the fact that her jacket was worn out and barely keeping her warm against the harsh cold. She shoved her hands into her pockets and glanced at her phone. Another job offer rejected. She sighed. Ever since she had lost her job as an assistant teacher at an elementary school, she had been struggling to pay rent and hold on to her dignity. The occasional babysitting gig helped her get by, but it wasn't enough. Her pride kept her from asking her family for help, and she refused to accept that she was on the verge of giving up. That was when something caught her attention. Across the street, a man was struggling to push a baby stroller through the accumulated snow. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped under the weight of fatigue and responsibility. Emily hesitated for a moment, but her instincts kicked in. "Need a hand?" she asked, stepping closer. The man looked up, surprised. He had dark circles under his eyes and a worn-out expression, but he gave her a small, grateful smile. "Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Daniel Parker, and this is my son, Oliver," he said, adjusting the blanket over the sleeping baby. Emily grabbed the side of the stroller, and together they made their way across the street to a modest apartment building. As they climbed the steps, Daniel glanced at her, hesitant. "Do you work as a babysitter? I need someone to take care of Oliver. Do you have experience?" She gave him a gentle smile. "I do, and I'd be happy to help." At that moment, she had no idea that this decision would change her life forever. The next morning, Emily arrived at Daniel Parker's apartment feeling a mix of excitement and uncertainty. The building was simple but welcoming, and when he opened the door, she immediately noticed the exhaustion written all over his face. The deep shadows under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders told the story of sleepless nights. He was clearly drained. "Please come in," Daniel said, stepping aside to let her enter. She walked in and took in the surroundings. The living room was small but tidy. A few baby toys were scattered on the rug, and on the coffee table, a messy pile of papers mixed bills with scribbled notes. In the kitchen, a half-empty baby bottle sat on the counter, a sign that the morning had already been rough. "Oliver's still asleep," Daniel said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know this all happened really fast, and I didn't get a chance to explain. But my son has been my only priority since my wife passed away a year ago. I try to juggle work and taking care of him, but it's complicated." Emily felt a pang in her chest. The pain in his voice was unmistakable. "I understand, Daniel," she replied softly. "It must be really tough handling everything on your own, but you don't have to do it alone." He sighed and managed a faint smile. "Thank you for being here." Before they could continue their conversation, a soft cry came from the bedroom. Daniel immediately rushed toward it, and Emily followed. Little Oliver, a 1.5-year-old baby, was rubbing his sleepy eyes while murmuring incoherent sounds. His light brown hair was tousled, and his cheeks were flushed from the warmth of his blanket. Emily instinctively smiled. "Hey, Oliver," she said gently, crouching beside the crib. The baby looked at her curiously, still clinging to his father. But instead of crying at the sight of a stranger, as she had expected, he reached out and grabbed one of Emily's fingers, holding on tightly. Daniel raised his eyebrows, surprised. "That's rare. He doesn't usually trust people this quickly." Emily felt a wave of warmth fill her heart. "I guess we're already friends, aren't we, little guy?" Oliver let out a soft giggle, kicking his tiny feet. In that instant, something inside Emily shifted. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like she wasn't just there for a temporary job. Somehow, this little boy and his father had already started carving out a special place in her heart, and she had no idea how that unexpected bond would change her life forever. In the days that followed, Emily quickly adapted to the rhythm of Daniel's home. At first, he seemed hesitant, as if he was still getting used to the idea of having someone else helping him. But it didn't take long for him to realize that Emily was different. She arrived early every morning, always with a warm smile, and cared for Oliver as if it were second nature. The little boy, who used to cry every time Daniel left for work, now remained calm, entertained by Emily's stories, games, and affection. "You have an incredible way with kids," Daniel remarked one evening, watching as Emily fed Oliver in his high chair. She smiled. "I've always loved taking care of little ones. Working with children makes me feel at home." He nodded, and for a brief moment, a comfortable silence settled between them. Emily noticed that, despite the tired expression on his face, Daniel was beginning to relax a little more. But it wasn't easy for him. That same night, Emily was startled awake by a noise coming from the hallway. Peeking through the door, she saw Daniel leaning against the wall, rubbing his forehead, clearly exhausted. She approached him slowly. "You okay?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm trying, but it's hard. Working all day, coming home, and still trying to be the father Oliver deserves. Sometimes, I feel like I'm failing." Emily frowned and shook her head. "You're not failing, Daniel. You're doing the best you can. And Oliver loves you. That's what matters." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. "Thank you, Emily. I don't know what I'd do without you." She gave him a soft smile. "Luckily, you don't have to find out." At that moment, Daniel realized something he hadn't wanted to admit. Emily was already a part of their lives, and maybe, just maybe, he needed her more than he thought. Days passed, and what had started as just a temporary job began to turn into something more. Emily found herself more and more involved in Oliver's life, and without realizing it, in Daniel's as well. Their morning routine remained the same. Emily arrived early, often bringing fresh coffee for Daniel, who, though reluctant at first, eventually accepted the gesture with a small, grateful smile. Then she prepared breakfast while he said goodbye to Oliver before heading off to work. One morning, as Daniel reached for the coffee cup Emily handed him, their fingers brushed for the briefest moment. It was quick, but they both felt it. She averted her eyes, and he cleared his throat before mumbling, "Thanks." But Emily knew something inside her was shifting. Oliver, on the other hand, made no effort to hide his affection. If he used to cry every time Daniel left, now he giggled excitedly at the sight of Emily, stretching his little arms up for her to hold him. "You've already won me over, little guy," Emily whispered one day, kissing his soft forehead. That afternoon, as they played in the living room, Daniel arrived home earlier than usual. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene before him. Oliver was laughing uncontrollably as Emily made silly faces. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to imagine something he hadn't dared to before: a family. He shook his head, pushing the thought away. Emily was the babysitter, nothing more. But then Oliver saw him and stretched out his arms. "Daddy," Daniel smiled, scooping his son up into his arms. "Hey, champ, having fun?" "Emily's funny." Daniel glanced at her and she grinned. "He's got good taste," she joked. Daniel's eyes met hers for a moment longer than necessary. Emily swallowed hard. Something was changing between them, but neither of them was ready to admit it. Not yet. Winter seemed more relentless by the day. That night, the snow fell heavily, covering the streets of Boston in a thick, silent white blanket. The wind howled fiercely against the windows, and the temperature kept dropping by the hour. Emily was about to leave when Daniel called out to her. "It's dangerous out there. You can stay here tonight if you want." She hesitated. She didn't want to be a burden, but looking at the dense snow piling up outside, she knew he was right. "All right, just until the storm eases up," she said, trying not to sound uncomfortable with the idea. Daniel set up a makeshift bed on the small couch, and Emily settled in, listening to the sound of the wind outside. The house was quiet when, in the middle of the night, a distressed cry echoed down the hallway. "Oliver." Emily got up quickly and rushed to the baby's room. He was sitting in his crib, quietly sobbing, his little arms trembling. "Hey, little one, what's wrong?" she whispered, picking him up. He nestled into her, burying his face against her shoulder. "Bad dream. Mommy left." Emily's heart tightened. She held him closer, running her fingers gently through his soft hair. "It's okay. I'm here. You're safe." She felt his tiny body gradually relax, his breathing slowing as he drifted back to sleep in her arms. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching. She lifted her eyes to him. "He still misses her." Daniel sighed, stepping into the room and running a hand through his hair. I do too. Every day. But with you here, things have gotten a little easier. Emily felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. Daniel moved closer, lowering his voice. I don't know how to say this without sounding weird, but I trust you, Emily. And so does Oliver. He loves you. She gave him a soft smile. I love him too, Daniel. He's an amazing little boy. For a brief moment, they stood there, watching Oliver sleep peacefully. And without needing to say a word, they both knew something had changed that night. The days after the storm brought more than just melting snow on the sidewalks. Emily could feel that something had shifted in that house. Oliver was more attached to her than ever, and Daniel seemed different too. He smiled more. He talked more. And sometimes she caught him looking at her for just a little too long before he quickly looked away. And that unsettled her. She had never thought of Daniel that way. At least, not consciously. He was her boss, a devoted father, a man who had suffered a great loss. And she? She was just the babysitter who had somehow become part of their home. But fate seemed determined to test her. On a quiet afternoon, as Emily played with Oliver in the living room, the doorbell rang. She didn't think much of it, until she heard a woman's voice at the door. Daniel, it's been so long. Emily instinctively stood up, holding Oliver in her arms, and came face to face with a tall woman with perfectly styled hair and a sophisticated coat. Oh, and who is this? The woman asked with a polite but slightly surprised smile. This is Emily. She takes care of Oliver, Daniel explained, his voice more restrained than usual. Emily forced a smile and nodded. Nice to meet you. The pleasure is mine. I'm Charlotte. The woman glanced at Oliver and smiled. You've grown so much. Emily felt her chest tighten. Charlotte clearly knew Daniel and Oliver. But who was she? She didn't want to seem nosy, but she also couldn't ignore the unease growing inside her. I'm going to take Oliver for a walk, she said, grabbing the baby's coat. Daniel looked at her as if he wanted to say something, but he hesitated. As Emily stepped outside, the cold air hit her face. Maybe she was overthinking. Maybe Charlotte was just someone from Daniel's past. But then why did it bother her so much? The icy wind stung Emily's face as she walked slowly through the snow-covered park, holding Oliver in her arms. The baby seemed indifferent to her restlessness, babbling a few words as he watched the few people brave enough to be outside in the cold. But Emily barely noticed. Charlotte's presence unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was just a family friend, someone offering support after Daniel lost his wife. Maybe. But then why hadn't he looked comfortable? Emily sighed, feeling a tightness in her chest that she wasn't ready to name. After nearly an hour of trying to clear her thoughts, she headed back to the apartment. As she opened the door, she found Daniel sitting on the couch, his hands clasped together. He looked up immediately, as if he had been waiting for her. I wanted to explain about Charlotte. Emily frowned slightly, closing the door behind her. You don't have to explain anything, Daniel. Yes, I do. He ran a hand through his hair, visibly uneasy. Charlotte and I dated years ago. Before my wife. Emily felt a small knot form in her throat, but she kept her expression neutral. I see. And she's back now because... Daniel exhaled heavily. She works at a big law firm here in Boston. She heard about everything that happened and wanted to see me. She said she was really sorry for what I went through and asked if we could stay in touch. Emily nodded, forcing a smile. That's great. It's always good to have support from friends. Daniel studied her for a moment. That's not exactly how you reacted when you left the house earlier. Emily felt her face heat up. I just thought you two were together, but that's none of my business. Emily, the way he said her name made her heart falter. She met his gaze, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. But before she could say anything, Oliver shifted in her arms, letting out a soft whimper. Reality came rushing back like a cold shock. Emily smiled at the baby, avoiding Daniel's eyes. Oliver needs a bath. She walked past him and into the bedroom without looking back. Daniel let out a heavy sigh, leaning against the couch. He knew he was feeling something for Emily, and now he was certain she felt the same. But there was one thing neither of them knew: how far they were willing to go with these feelings. The following days were oddly quiet. Emily did her best to keep things strictly professional. She showed up, took care of Oliver with all the love in the world, and avoided any prolonged interactions with Daniel. If their conversations had once been lighthearted and full of smiles, now they were limited to the essentials. Oliver ate well today. He napped without any trouble. I'll bring some new books for him tomorrow. Daniel noticed the shift, but he didn't push. He was just as confused about his own feelings. Between Charlotte's frequent visits and Emily's constant presence, he felt caught between the past and something new that was growing inside him, until everything changed in a single night. Emily's phone rang in the middle of the night. Daniel's number flashed on the screen. Her heart jumped as she answered. "Daniel!" His voice on the other end was tense, frantic. "It's Oliver. He has a high fever. I don't know what to do." Emily didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat, slipped on her boots, and rushed out, ignoring the biting cold of the night. When she arrived at the apartment, she found Daniel pacing back and forth, holding Oliver in his arms. The baby whimpered softly, his cheeks flushed with fever. He was fine earlier, but suddenly he got really warm and started whining. I tried giving him a lukewarm bath, but it didn't help. Daniel's voice was thick with worry. Emily took Oliver in her arms, feeling the heat of his fever against her skin. "We're taking him to the hospital, now." Wasting no time, they hurried to the car, the snow falling softly around them. The whole drive, Daniel never let go of Oliver's tiny hand, whispering reassurances, while Emily focused on the road, trying to ignore the fear tightening in her chest. When they arrived at the emergency room, a doctor attended to them quickly. After a few tests, the diagnosis was clear: a common viral infection, but one that required monitoring for a few hours. Emily exhaled, relief washing over her, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that night. In the corner of the hospital room, Daniel lowered his head into his hands. She stepped closer and gently touched his shoulder. "He's going to be okay." Daniel looked up at her, his eyes glassy with emotion. "What if I fail him? What if one day I don't catch something serious in time?" Without thinking, Emily took his hands in hers. "You're not alone, Daniel. Oliver has you. And he has me too." For a moment, the world around them seemed to pause. The line between babysitter and employer, between friendship and something more, was growing thinner, but neither of them had the courage to cross it. Not yet. The scare with Oliver was a wake-up call for Daniel. He couldn't do everything on his own. In the days that followed, Emily remained by Oliver's side, making sure he recovered well. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed different, quieter, more introspective, as if he was battling something inside himself. Until one night, he asked to talk. "Charlotte invited me to a charity event on Saturday." Emily furrowed her brows, surprised by the sudden shift in conversation. "Oh, I see. And are you going?" Daniel hesitated for a second before answering. "I thought it might be good for me to start socializing again, meet new people." Emily felt a tightness in her chest but forced a smile. "That sounds great, Daniel. You deserve to have some fun." He studied her for a long moment. "Do you really think that?" She averted her gaze, busying herself by straightening one of Oliver's toys on the table. "Of course. If you think you're ready to move forward, why not?" The silence between them was heavy. Then Daniel took a step forward. "And what if I don't want to move forward with Charlotte?" Emily's heart pounded. She lifted her gaze, meeting his. "Daniel!" He shook his head, letting out a sigh. "Ever since you came into our lives, everything has changed." Oliver smiles more. "I feel less alone, and I can't ignore that anymore, Emily." She felt her face grow warm, her chest tightening with all the emotions she had tried so hard to suppress. Before she could finish her sentence, Oliver's cry echoed from the bedroom, cutting through the moment. Emily hurried to tend to the baby while Daniel stood there, watching her leave. And in that instant, he knew there was no turning back. He was in love, and he needed to find out if she felt the same. That night, Emily barely slept. Daniel's words kept repeating in her mind. "I can't ignore this anymore." She knew exactly what he meant. She knew that the looks, the gestures, and the moments they had shared over the past few weeks meant more than either of them had been willing to admit. But what if all of this was a mistake? She didn't want to be just a bandage for a broken heart. She didn't want to fool herself into believing she was special. only to find out in the end that Charlotte, or someone else, would take her place. The next day, when she arrived at the apartment, the tension between them was almost tangible. Daniel watched her for a long moment before finally speaking. "I know I caught you off guard yesterday, and if you want to pretend nothing happened, I understand." Emily pressed her lips together, staring at the floor. "Daniel, I need to know. Are you sure about what you feel? Or am I just someone helping you move on?" He stepped closer, his gaze intense. "Emily, do you really think I don't see it? You're not just someone who takes care of Oliver, you're part of our lives." Her heart pounded. "And Charlotte?" Daniel sighed. "I've already made my decision. It's not Charlotte I want by my side." Emily looked away, feeling the weight of the moment. Then, something happened. Oliver, who had been playing quietly on the rug, stood up and toddled over to her, grabbing onto the hem of her shirt with his tiny hand. "Emily, stay?" Her chest tightened. She knelt down and picked him up, holding him close. Daniel watched the scene unfold, and at that moment, Emily knew. She knew she was already part of this family. She knew she didn't want to leave. She lifted her gaze to Daniel and smiled. "I'm staying." His expression softened. He let out a deep breath, relief washing over his face. And for the first time, he didn't hesitate. He took a step forward and wrapped his arms around her. And for the first time since losing his wife, Daniel felt the weight of loneliness finally lift, because now he knew he wasn't alone anymore.